Mink coat, mink COVID. Mink around the world are dying from coronavirus. And when they're not, the virus is mutating and spreading to humans. It's a problem in Denmark and now in the U.S. Find out where next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. On today's episode, promising vaccine news could be compromised as the coronavirus is mutating among mink in farms in Europe and the U.S., and it's spreading to humans. The mink have been dying since October in farms in Utah and in Wisconsin, and nothing has been done in those states. We'll talk to an activist in Utah. But first, in Europe, the problem has now hit Denmark, where PETA has advocated the emergency shutdown of the fur industry. Sascha Camilli is a media special projects coordinator for PETA UK, where a protest is planned this week in London at the Danish consulate. I spoke to Camilli before the protest.
Coronavirus has been found on mink farms in Denmark. Now, that in itself is not necessarily something new. We have seen the virus on fur farms in the Netherlands, in the US, in Spain. There have been lots of cases in several countries that still have mink farming. But what's special about these cases in Denmark is that this is a new strain of the virus. It's mutated. And this mutation could actually mean that a forthcoming vaccine could be less effective. The Prime Minister of Denmark has said that the situation is very, very serious. And the State Serum Institute, whose job it is to look into infectious diseases in Denmark, have said that the worst case scenario for this is for a whole new pandemic to start out of Denmark. So it's a very alarming situation.
Well, this is a serious thing, and I don't mean to make light of that, but clearly, as we're talking, the animals are speaking. We can hear some animals in the background. They're birds, I think. They're concerned. I mean, these mink are they act like a reservoir for the coronavirus in a way, huh? And they have coronavirus.
Yeah, this situation with the mink is basically, if we think about where the virus is believed to have originated, scientists think that it came from live animal markets in Asia. If we look at fur farms and the way that animals live and the way that they're kept is really not that different from those live animal markets, which means that they are kept in cramped conditions in these tiny wire cages that are often stacked one on top of another. And the exchange of bodily fluids means that it's very easy for bacteria to flourish, and it's a great breeding ground for pandemics. And that's what makes the fur trade such a dangerous one when it comes to public health.
Now what's happening to the workers? Has any of the workers or any human beings contracted coronavirus?
In the Netherlands, there were a few cases where it was believed that the virus had spread. But with this mutation in Denmark, about a dozen people are known to have been infected with this new strain.
And so the initial reaction by the Danish government was to kill all the mink and to cull the mink, C-U-L-L. What has happened since that initial call?
So, the plans were to cull all of the mink in the country, which is between 15 and 17 million animals. And those plans have since been scrapped. Culls have happened in other countries as well. Netherlands have culled animals. Spain has as well. And many people are quite outraged at seeing this and knowing that this huge number of animals were planned to die because of this. And it's just really important to remember that in any case, even if we would not been having a pandemic, even without a cull, these animals would have been killed anyway in really gruesome, cruel ways for their fur. When it comes to killing these animals for fur, farmers use the cheapest methods they have available, and their priority is keeping the pelts intact and not to spare the animals further suffering. So all over the world, animals in the fur trade are killed by gassing, by poisoning, electrocution, drowning. So very cruel means.
So what happens if they initially they were going to cull? Are they still going to cull? What is the change in the Danish position?
No, so they're not doing the cull anymore because of, I believe the reasons used were that it's a loss of livelihood, because obviously there's, it's an industry and mink farmers would be losing their livelihoods, which is also something that we need to remember, that first of all, with the pandemic, people are losing their jobs anyway. And so many people since the start of this have lost their jobs, have faced more uncertainty when it comes to jobs. And if the worst case scenario comes true and we have a new wave start out of Denmark, then obviously this will mean even more uncertainty and even more job losses. It's definitely still risky to continue with this because this strain is unprecedented and this virus is very new. We don't know much about it. So there's really no way to be sure that whatever measures are put in place will be enough to protect the public.
So PETA wants the Danish to ban the fur, but ultimately that must mean that they have to cull the mink, right?
Well, we're always asking countries everywhere and to ban the fur trade, but we've been pushing for Denmark specifically since the first cases of coronavirus were found. And yes, this would probably mean in this case that these animals would have to be culled, but this is not a choice between killing animals or keeping them alive. It's the choice is between killing them or still killing them. But if we are to ban the fur trade, that would mean no more animals would be bred into this miserable life of extreme confinement, of neglect, of disease, and ultimately a very painful and terrifying death, which we also know now that this trade can be a danger to public health. So now it's a matter of urgency. Now is the time for urgent action. And just like the Netherlands, Poland, and France recently all announced that they're putting an end to the fur trade in these countries, we really hope that the Danish government will see just how much of an emergency this is and just bring a ban into effect soon.
Sascha Camilli of the PETA UK office on the emergency call to end the fur trade due to the potential danger of mink spreading the coronavirus to humans. The same problem exists in two states, Utah and Wisconsin, already beset with rising numbers of coronavirus cases, hospitalizations, and deaths among humans. Now both states have mink farms that are reservoirs of coronavirus mutation that have killed mink and infected workers. I talked to Utah Animal Rights Coalition's Jeremy Beckham. We've had a mink problem in the United States since October, when there have been thousands of mink dead in U.S. fur farms, and not just where you are in Utah, but also in Wisconsin. So that was in October that happened. Here we are now in November. How much worse is it in Utah right now?
Yeah, and I think it also should be stressed, we know that the first identified cases of the virus, it's called SARS-CoV-2. That's the virus that causes COVID-19. And the first identified cases of SARS-CoV-2 in mink farms was actually in August here in Utah. And Utah Animal Rights Coalition, or UARC wrote to the governor back in August to ask that this matter be investigated, that we increase testing, and that we at least put in a moratorium on breeding more mink until we can figure out exactly how serious this threat is. And that was back in August when we had outbreaks, I think they said in at least 5 Utah mink farms at the time. And Utah is the second leading mink producing state in the country. Utah and Wisconsin lead the country in number of mink farms and number of mink killed for their fur. So that was back in August. And unfortunately, nothing was done. The problem has continued to grow. And now we know that at least in October, there were at least 11 separate mink farms here in Utah that have had COVID-19 outbreaks among their mink. These mink probably got the virus from the workers. But what's really concerning about this is it appears more and more research is pointing to the fact that there's what they call bidirectional zoonotic transmission of the SARS-CoV-2 virus between mink and humans. That means humans can give it to the mink, it can circulate among the mink, and then it can pass back from mink to humans.
Wow. Has there been any example of that happening since this story first broke in October? I mean, we knew about it in August. They did nothing. It kind of exploded in October. Now here we are in November. How much worse has it gotten?
The really scary thing is, honestly, here in the United States, we don't even really know, because this problem is being so ignored and overlooked by all of our leaders. Governor Herbert here in Utah still hasn't even addressed this issue of these COVID-19 mink outbreaks. We do know that in Europe, however, where they've been taking the problem much more seriously, there have been several studies that have been done in Spain and in Denmark and in the Netherlands, where what they do is they look at workers on these mink farms who have got sick from the virus that caused COVID-19, and they've done genomic sequencing. And if you do genomic sequencing of the virus they're shedding and the virus that the mink on these farms are shedding, you can tell with a high degree of probability whether or not the virus that the workers have was first in the mink, and if the virus is mutating in the mink. And that's cause for extreme concern. And these genomic sequencing tests in Europe are concluding that the virus is mutating in the animals before it's being transmitted back to humans. Now, what's happening in Utah is still a black box, because we're not doing any kind of testing of these workers. We're not putting these farms on any kind of surveillance for further outbreaks. It's really just a voluntary system of reporting that they're having right now. And there's nothing like genomic sequencing going on. So it's very possible that already, here we are at the beginning of November, it's very possible that there may be mutant strains of COVID circulating in the human population of Utah from mink farms, and we wouldn't even know it.
Wow.
Because we're not doing the kind of investigation we would need to do to determine that.
So the mutation, right, the workers had it first, passed it on to the mink. The mink in these huge mink farms in Utah started the virus started replicating, right?
That's called amplification.
Right.
That process.
And mutating, right? And now you're saying that it's been given back, or we wouldn't know because we haven't tested, but the suspicion is the virus is given back in this mutated form back to workers, and now it's in the community. We don't know exactly how much, or people could be asymptomatic, but it's out there. It's out there.
So in Denmark, where we know the most about the situation, we know that in Denmark, there have been at least 214 confirmed cases in humans of what they're calling the Mink variant strain of COVID-19. That's actually what the scientists are calling it. They've called it the Mink strain. So there have been at least 214 people infected with this strain that mutated in the mink. And what's really concerning is that the virologists and the microbiologists that have studied this say that this mutated form of this virus, every virus is surrounded by this protein, by this membrane that has proteins on the surface of that membrane. And those proteins are how most of our vaccines work. They basically target those proteins on the surface of that membrane and then and that target stimulates your body to produce antibodies that are kind of on the hunt for that protein on the surface of the virus. If there's a mutation that causes those surface proteins to change, though, the antibodies your body produce will miss this novel virus again. So the real concern here for the immediate short term is that the mink strain we already know about is going to evade the vaccines that are under development right now. And if the virus continues to spread among mink populations and fur farms, not only might you have the problem of evading vaccines, it's very possible that the virus may also mutate in a way to make the virus more transmissible, or to make the virus more dangerous, more lethal. SARS-CoV-2 still has something like 1% or even a little less overall case fatality rate. It's not smallpox, thank God. Yeah. But if it mutates in a way that makes it more lethal, it could be. In a weird way, this sounds crazy since it's upended our lives, but there are some aspects of COVID-19 that we lucked out on. There's no reason that it couldn't be even more lethal and dangerous than it already is, like the Spanish flu of 1918. It could be something like that.
Right.
Every one of these mink farms is a potential biological factory to churn out a more dangerous form of the virus.
And the problem is that we are preparing a vaccine or vaccines that would take care of the strain that we know. And we might be under this false assumption, oh, we have this answer, but it's just like the flu vaccine. It's for last year's flu, not for whatever's, churning around about in our society now. So there's a kind of fallacy there that no one ever really, they acknowledge, but they just say, oh, it's just a vaccine. And then they cross their fingers. But
that's right. Viruses are moving targets to some degree. Now, some viruses have a greater degree of antigen shift than other viruses. So some of them are faster moving targets than others, but they're all moving targets to some degree. And the danger that the mink farms pose is that every single time the virus finds a new host for itself to replicate itself, that's another potential point for a mutation or amplification of the virus. Yeah, so if we can slow the spread of the virus, that also reduces the propensity of it to mutate into a more dangerous form. The problem is that on mink farms, you have literally thousands of mink crammed together right next to each other in these tiny shoebox-sized cages, and they're all spreading their respiratory droplets to one another. Believe me, I've seen these mink farms with my own eyes. There's no social distancing possible on these mink farms. All of these mink are in very close quarters, so as soon as one mink just through genetic lottery happens to mutate a more dangerous or transmissible form of the virus, it's going to spread like wildfire among the entire population there. And then if that gets transmitted into humans from there, the workers on the farm, we're going to be in a world of trouble. And so that's what's so dangerous, uniquely dangerous about these mink farms is if these mink farms had, 5, 10, 15 mink, the risk could probably be pretty low, to be honest with you, because that's a small population for potential amplification and mutation. As soon as you talk about 10,000 mink all crammed together, now you've got a biohazard, is really what that is. That's a biohazard. They're all acting as little factories for the virus. And here's what's even more scary. Every single year on these mink farms, they're restocking and replacing the whole population. So if you have any kind of hope of something resembling, herd immunity developing on these mink farms, that's never going to happen because each year a new generation of immunologically naive mink are going to be born on these operations. They're all going to keep getting infected. So this problem, honestly, will never be solved as long as the virus that causes COVID-19 is circulating in the human population. It's going to be circulating in the mink population as well, and those mink are all going to act as potential sources of mutation.
Okay, right now, though, the people who are enabling this are the workers who keep going to work, right? It doesn't spread in the population unless the workers go in and catch it and then go back out. But chances are, if they're in close proximity to these viral factories, these mink, chances are they will, in time, contract the virus and then spread it to the general population. And
that's right.
And right now, no one at the state level is doing anything about it. No one at the federal level is telling anyone at the state level to do anything about this.
Correct. Right now, there is nothing happening at all from our state leaders to control this problem. As far as I can tell, they're pretending like the problem doesn't even exist. There's been a couple media reports about it, but although the governor has moved to do things like limit capacity in bars and cancel all mass gatherings, and we've all been asked to make various sacrifices in various ways, these mink farms have evaded all these requirements. They don't even have testing. Yeah. So we're not even testing the animals on these farms or testing the workers on these farms. At least within a slaughterhouse facility, most of the slaughterhouses have started doing mandatory testing of their workers. And also I want to stress, I've seen many mink farms in Utah with my own eyes. These are not BSL-4 style laboratories by any means. Usually it's just some sheds behind someone's home, and they've got guests over, extended family that may go back there in and out of the sheds in the general area. Many of these mink farms also have surrounding feral cat populations because feral cats also like to eat the feed that the mink eat. So these are porous facilities, I guess is what I'm saying. So even aside from the workers, there are people coming and going, people delivering feed. People are coming and going from these facilities all the time. This is not a tightly controlled, sealed off laboratory.
Well, it's a work day, right? And people are working around the clock, attending to the mink and bringing, like you say, supplies. Where are these farms located, and where are they in proximity to the largest, say, human populations in Utah?
Sure. So here in Utah, what's amazing is we've had, in the last 10 years, the population of Utah has really skyrocketed. And we've had a lot of suburban sprawl in what they call the Wasatch Front, which is basically the area all the way from Ogden down to Provo. And believe it or not, there are a lot of these really large mink farms now that are embedded in suburban development. I mean, you wouldn't believe your eyes if you saw it. Like there's a town called Lehi that has something like half a dozen operating mink farms still. And just surrounding these mink farms now are new development, high density condo development, apartment complexes. So really large communities have already started to spread around these mink farms.
How far from say, Salt Lake or Provo is Lehi?
Lehi is a suburb of Provo, and it's not that far from Salt Lake either. It's maybe a 20 miles from Salt Lake, something like that. It's not far at all. And the entire, this must be stressed too, the entire stretch from Salt Lake to Lehi is essentially one continuous development now. I mean, you go down from Salt Lake, down to Murray, down to Sandy, down to American Fork, down to Lehi. There's, human populations all along that area. And this is the fastest growing part of the state as well. More and more people are moving to Utah County and Salt Lake County than any other part of the state.
And so right there in Lehi, you say 5 to 6 of these mink farms, these fur farms?
That's our best guess. But to be honest with you, it's almost getting hard to know because the mink industry is right now, even before COVID, the mink industry has been in a state of financial freefall. Fewer and fewer people are buying fur products. There's growing awareness that it's, just inexcusable cruelty involved in the production of mink coats and fur products. The state of California has completely banned the sale of fur, and even the international markets like in China are starting to slow down and dry up. So, I mean, just in the last 5 years, from 2014 to 2019, there have been 42% fewer mink killed for their fur on Utah farms, and the price that farmers are fetching for each mink's body has also decreased by 62%. So the amount of money they're getting per mink has decreased, and the number of mink they're selling has decreased. So they've been hit financially hard, very, very severely. And we've already seen in the last year, the fur industry itself said about half of Utah mink farms have closed just in the last year. And so it can be a little hard to know when you drive by one of these mink farms if what you're really looking at is the remains of an operational fur farm versus one still in business.
So, Jeremy, what's the best if they were allowed to take the advice of animal rights activists, and they really should, but if the state wanted to do the best thing for the people and for the mink, I guess the best thing would be to cull the mink, right? To just somehow peacefully euthanize the mink.
So it has to be said that we're coming up here usually at the end of November. So we're just talking a few weeks from now is what the fur industry calls pelting season. And pelting is, practically another word for culling. So they are on the verge now in just a couple weeks. They are going to empty these farms with the exception of the breeding females, which is hardly any of the mink. The vast majority of the mink are about to be killed just so that we can sell their skins, and have economic activity. So really what should probably happen at this point is with the recognition that that's going to happen anyway. And let's be honest, these mink are doomed. I mean, they're born confined to these tiny cages. And the best thing we can do now is stop future generations of them from being born. So what the state really should do at this point is say, hey, mink industry, this is your last pelting season. And this is what happened when a fur farmer decides to retire and go out of business too. This is your last pelting season. Kill every last mink. Obviously, that's a horrific crime that we should have never been in this position to begin with. But here we are. They're here now. I'm realistic and recognize that they're going to be pelting in a couple weeks, whether I like it or not. But we should make this the last pelting season. Pelt out all your mink. No more breeding. This is the last generation. 2020 is the last generation of mink farming in Utah. That's what state leaders should do.
And it's not just because, it's really brought on, not just because of the worldwide market falling apart, but it's a public health hazard right now to have these mink continue to live and to regenerate the virus, the COVID virus.
Just imagine if next spring, when they start repopulating their sheds with new kits, new young mink, and all these mink are going to be susceptible once again to COVID-19. Just imagine if this virus mutates into a form that evades one of these vaccines that we're probably about to see come on the market soon. That will mean that all of this time that we all spent social distancing, shutting down concerts, not going to church, not going to conferences, working from home, pouring billions and billions of dollars into accelerating the development of a vaccine, it will have all been for nothing, just so a handful of fur farmers here in Utah can keep selling mink pelts to China. And I think that's a ridiculous bargain, to ask the rest of the country to undergo all of these enormous sacrifices that we just went through, to risk throwing that all away for this tiny dying industry, just seems foolish to the point of absurdity.
Yeah, but right now, inaction is what's happening. No one's doing anything about this.
Yep, and that's why we keep putting more pressure on the governor. We were planning a rally up at the Capitol later this week to put pressure on the governor to do something about it. But ironically, because COVID-19 is spiraling out of control here in Utah again, we have new governor orders that basically heavily restrict social gatherings with people outside your home. And so because of these orders that are in effect for the next 14 days, we've kind of put those on pause. But we're continuing to put pressure wherever we can, calling his office, asking our members and supporters. We've already had over 1,000 Utahns take action on our website to send a message to Governor Herbert to do something about this. We've had some interest from Salt Lake Tribune reporters looking at this issue as well. So I think the most important thing we can do is keep this issue alive, to make it so that our state leaders finally have to address this issue now rather than address it when we already have a really serious disaster on our hands. And that's what I fear, is that we're going to wait too long and they're going to address it after this mutated virus has already been unleashed on the community.
And isn't it kind of somewhat ironic that Utah and Wisconsin are beset by this problem? Nothing's been done in Utah. What's the situation in Wisconsin, where they also have thousands of mink and they also have a huge COVID crisis, a human COVID crisis on top of that?
Yeah, Wisconsin is much the same. The state government there is monitoring some of these outbreaks on some of these mink farms. And, they've tested and identified positively that a lot of the mink who have been dying from COVID-19, have been dying on these farms, have been dying from COVID-19. But what we still haven't seen in Wisconsin or in Utah or anywhere else is the kind of affirmative action we're seeing in Europe, which is taking proactive steps to say, like in the Netherlands, they had already said, we're going to end the fur farming industry in 2024. But because of the COVID crisis, they said, no, we're moving that up 4 years. And this is your last year. Pelt out your sheds. Mink farming is dead in the Netherlands now. And that's what we need to have here. Mink farming is dead in Utah and Wisconsin. And anything short of that is not going to solve the problem.
And other countries in Europe also facing this problem. We talked to PETA UK, and they're talking about Denmark. And I guess what this shows is that mink are susceptible worldwide. COVID crisis is worldwide, and we shouldn't have these mink COVID factory spread, because these mink are, replicating the disease, and it really just spells the doom for the mink industry worldwide, globally.
Yep. And really all it's done is accelerated the doom of the mink industry. The mink industry, from 2014 to 2019, their profits had already declined 73%. 73%. Okay. That's 5 years before COVID hit the world stage. So they were already on the way out the door. We just need to speed that process up, because now we have a novel virus threatening our public health.
So, Jeremy, I appreciate you being on the PETA podcast. You're with what's your group there in Utah now?
Yeah, we're called Utah Animal Rights Coalition, or UARC, and we're basically a local grassroots advocacy and service project-oriented organization. So we're an animal rights advocacy organization trying to end the fur trade in Utah, promote veganism. A lot of the same kind of stuff that PETA is doing on a national stage, but we're doing it here locally in Utah.
We were talking earlier, the COVID crisis has hit the human population, and yet people aren't paying attention. Do they even know about the mink crisis as well as they should? Or is it one of those things that's being so downplayed in Utah?
I mean, local media, including the Salt Lake Tribune and some of the TV stations, have reported on this a little bit already. But I don't think it's getting the attention it deserves, most especially from our state leaders. So even though the Salt Lake Tribune, they've run a couple stories even now at this point about these COVID-19 outbreaks on Utah mink farms, but I have not seen once our governor, Gary Herbert, our lieutenant governor, who's soon to be governor, Spencer Cox, nor have I even seen our state epidemiologist, Dr. Angela Dunn, who's a very public figure here in Utah talking about the COVID-19 pandemic. I haven't seen any of them even mention the mink outbreak in Utah. And I suspect part of that, frankly, is political. A lot of these people are responding to their constituencies, which are heavily rural. And the agricultural industry here in Utah is a very powerful lobby. So I have no doubt that some of the reason it's being ignored is because of political power of the mink farming and by extension, the agricultural industry. But eventually we're going to need our state leaders to recognize that they represent all Utahns. They have to be looking out for the public health of all of us. And that needs to matter more than this. At this point, it's even a tiny amount of money being made by this dying industry. And it's really just, absurd that those interests are being weighed more heavily than possibly winding back all of the progress we've made on vaccine development, social distancing, and all of that could be undone immediately if we don't address the mink farms here in Utah.
All right, Jeremy, but I just want to make sure that people know we are not overstating this case. We've got thousands upon thousands, it's about 8,000 or 10,000 mink in Utah, or more than that. I mean,
at least 10,000 mink on Utah mink farms have already died from COVID-19. So we know it's already spreading on our fur farms. We also know that the fur industry itself has, when they're speaking privately behind closed doors, they've acknowledged that this is a really serious threat. UARC actually was leaked a video from their annual conference where Dr. Easley, who's the head of their research, this is a veterinarian who studies, he's a specialist in studying the health of mink for the industry. And Dr. Easley at their annual meeting said, yes, research is showing the virus is amplifying and mutating in the mink and then being translated back to humans. And this is a very serious problem for the industry. They recognize it when they're talking behind closed doors, but they're worried about the public catching on and what that means for their industry, because it will accelerate the demise. As soon as people recognize the threat that this is, there will be calls to shut down this industry. Because at the end of the day, it's not fair to ask all of our restaurants, all of our bars, all of our festivals, all of our concerts, all of our schools, all of our churches to have all of these sacrifices that may just get tossed out the window because of this one tiny dying industry. That's not going to be a politically feasible position.
Just to let people know how serious this is, it's like the mink are replicating the virus in these mink farms, and thousands have died. There's still thousands of these farms waiting to be pelted. So as you said earlier, the only real safe way to go about dealing with this is to cull, C-U-L-L, cull them all, which is to euthanize if they prepare these pelts for sale, does the virus die with the pelts? Is it still a contagious situation, or how safe are the pelts if they cull the mink and then sell the pelts?
Yeah, the virus that causes COVID-19 does need a living host. So those pelts will be, safe for human. They can safely be close to humans and not risk transmitting the virus once those animals are dead. So the bigger risk isn't necessarily with the pelts themselves. The problem is that if you're really going to keep a small number of them around for breeding for next season, we're just going to go through this whole thing again next year. It's not like there's going to be an end in sight. You're going to breed thousands of new mink in 2021. All of them are going to get infected again if they're exposed to this virus. All of them are potentially factories for a mutated more serious strain of the virus. So this problem will never reach any kind of natural endpoint so long as these mink farms are in operation and breeding whole new generations of immunologically naive mink, all crammed together, 6 inches apart from each other, spreading the virus among each other. They're just going to be perpetual factories for the virus that causes COVID-19, and they're also going to be, all of them, potential sources of mutation.
Jeremy Beckham with UARC, Utah Animal Rights Coalition. Always a pleasure to talk to you, Jeremy. Thank you for being on the PETA Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Emil.
Jeremy Beckham of the Utah Animal Rights Coalition on the mink coronavirus problem that state leaders there still haven't come to terms with. It's also spreading and happening in Wisconsin, and it's become a global problem with mink farms all over the world, most recently Denmark, where PETA has called for an emergency end to the fur industry there. And that's our show this time out. For more, go to PETA.org, and you can contact us at PETA.org. Find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or on AMOK.com, or see my work at ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, that's AALDEF.org/blog. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts, where you can rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music is provided with permission by Carbonworks. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.